undoubtedly the two most expansive and fleshed out worlds we've ever seen in a Zelda. Two games that had very similar agendas going into development to craft the greatest overworld yet. What's up my homies, it's Edible Incredible, and today I'll be comparing Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Kingdom to the Wind Waker's Great Sea, and more specifically debating on which one was more groundbreaking for its time. So first and foremost, obviously the illustrious Hyrule Kingdom is a much better overworld, but when I compare certain traits throughout this video, I'll be keeping in mind that the Wind Waker released in 2002. Its world doesn't have nowhere near as much content, however for its time of release it most definitely laid its fingerprints all over the industry. So I'll be categorizing this comparison into 6 different sections: overworld bosses, towns and settlements, travel methods, the two worlds' backstories, mini dungeons, and the overall feel and atmosphere that these maps give off. Let's begin with the methods of traversing. You could say the Wind Waker originated a foundation to the future paraglider with its Deku Leaf. Sure, it unfortunately doesn't glide nowhere near as smooth as the paraglider, but I love the realism of having to adjust the wind direction before flight. Well, not that we all possess the ability to alter Mother Nature like some special boyo. Something another special boy should have been able to control. But realism meaning to keep in mind which direction the wind is currently blowing. It makes you truly feel like an adventurer. I didn't necessarily want this in Breath of the Wild. It definitely would have slowed things down quite a bit. But how it's improved upon in the Wind Waker HD is sweet. Cutting down on the unnecessary and repetitive cutscenes to allow complete mastery of the wind with one single button press. So we also have the traditional horseback riding in Breath of the Wild, and the scrutinized yet beloved sailing of the Wind Waker. I say scrutinized yet beloved since it seems to be a very love it or hate it thing in the Zelda community. For the early 2000s, being able to freely sail a massive sea, period, was unprecedented. Although, I do wish we had more things to do on the boat, other than just jumping and shooting cannons. Imagine the boat flicking you into the air, similar to the original Breath of the Wild trailer, allowing us to use bullet time, or perform a downward strike on an octa. If we ever get a future Zelda set in another expansive sea, I'd expect some sexy new moves given to us while sailing. Horseback riding in Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, was easily the greatest the series has ever produced. With all the stray horses and their varying abilities, giving us reason to cherish and care for a specific horse, as it slowly gains your trust. If the Wind Waker had this layer of depth with different types of boats, it'd give sailing more meaning since the player would eagerly want to test out a newly acquired boat. Of course, the aspect of being able to climb almost anything in Breath of the Wild outclasses the Wind Waker's Great Sea with one function alone. That being said, Breath of the Wild's paraglider probably wouldn't be as awesome if it wasn't for Nintendo first testing out this mechanic with the Deku Leaf. So next, let's compare these worlds' underlying backstories. They both rely on a post-apocalyptic vibe. One that keeps that vibe under wraps, and another that uses it front and center to flesh out the world. Breath of the Wild being the latter, Calamity Ganon's corrupted Hyrule Castle is seen almost everywhere in Hyrule. Residents can sense that their impending doom just may be creeping in. The Wind Waker, on the other hand, locks up this dreary feeling underneath its glorious Great Sea, where these islanders are oblivious to the horror that just awakened beneath their feet. Little did they know, they were in fact the descendants of the small few who were able to make it to the mountaintops in time, prior to Zelda's most catastrophic event, the Great Flood. The way the Wind Waker's world appears to be on the surface, with its cheerful and cartoony aesthetics, beautifully contrasts that of its past and the upcoming threat. For that reason alone, the better world-building backstory easily goes to the Wind Waker. So now I want to discuss the towns and settlements of each. Breath of the Wild has 7 counting Terry Town. The Wind Waker has 4 if you include Forest Haven and Dragon Roost. Naturally, a world as spacious as Breath of the Wild's is gonna have more settlements. Although it is one thing I wish they capitalized on a bit more in the Wind Waker. Maybe a small town or two replacing the reefs. But then again, it was 2002, when fall had plenty of activities by itself. It filled the void for its time, and honestly, even though Breath of the Wild almost had double the amount of towns, I still found myself wanting more Lorland-like villages. Ones that wouldn't be a part of the main quest, but instead were only found randomly. I loved the feeling of stumbling upon Lorland when I thought I've seen all the civilization the world had to offer. Hopefully they add more of these types of sporadically placed settlements in Breath of the Wild too. And if you count enemy strongholds as a town or settlement, obviously Breath of the Wild had the best with Hyrule Castle. Although the Wind Waker's Forsaken Fortress nicely flies under people's radar in my belief. The feeling of wrecking house on Link's second arrival is so satisfying after being forced to go stealthy and healthy on the first go around. Alright, so next, let's quickly touch on the overworld's atmosphere and feel. As scrutinized as Breath of the Wild unfortunately is for its subtle approach to the world's musical score, having a more upbeat Hyrule Field theme, for example, wouldn't fit whatsoever. The slow and minuscule vibe of this soundtrack I feel is the only approach they could have took. Us Zelda fans just aren't as accustomed to this style. Games like The Wind Waker have loud and booming overworld pieces, which works well in its respected environment. The feeling of sailing a vast ocean needs something as adventurous as the Great Sea theme. If it was more of a dark-toned and realistic graphical style, just maybe something more subtle and akin to the emptiness an ocean portrays could have fit better in that specific overall approach. But what we got with The Wind Waker is by far my favorite undertaking of an overworld theme. It just never gets old. Okay, so now onto the mini dungeons scattered across these versions of Hyrule. Of course, like most of these categories, Breath of the Wild is littered with mini dungeons galore, while The Wind Waker relies on the Triforce Hunt gauntlets, and in particular, the Savage Labyrinth. This is something I would have loved to see in Breath of the Wild, especially with the addition of the Lynels. But the combat has improved leaps and bounds from the simplistic one-button press of a counter to a well-timed parry. Shrines were the meat and potatoes of Breath of the Wild's exploration. With such an innovative concept, I'd say Breath of the Wild takes home the more influential mini-dungeons. However, there's still room for improvement by making these shrines differ in concept and design. If Breath of the Wild 2 does in fact add to the existing enemy variety, a combat-focused labyrinth would be awesome. The Breath of the Wild treasure-filled labyrinths were a step in the right direction though. Their size alone was jaw-dropping. And speaking of enemies, Breath of the Wild did add a few new overworld bosses to the Zelda catalog, with Moduga probably being my favorite of the three. The Wind Waker only really had the Big Octo. You could count the giant tornadoes as another, but you only truly get to do battle with him once, unlocking the Ballad of Gales with the Wind God's defeat. The Big Octo though is one of my favorite overworld bosses throughout the whole series. There's a total of 6 of them scattered across the Great Sea, and there's numerous ways to deal with them. But I prefer using the boomerang to lock onto multiple eyes at once. Even though it's the least impactful method damage-wise, I just love slapping them with the boomerang over and over. Once again, I do wish there was more monstrosities in the ocean similar to the Big Octo. The Wind Waker probably has my favorite overworld boss out of these two games, but Breath of the Wild just has more to mess around with. So in conclusion, thematically, my preference leans towards the ambience of the Great Sea. It'll be remembered for its colorful way of drawing you into its luscious world. But Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Kingdom is currently the pinnacle of Zelda exploration. Which will be more immortalized, say 30 years from now? It's hard to say. I feel like the Wind Waker sticks out more in my head because of how much the environment pops. But again, Breath of the Wild really capitalized on more of a natural feeling world. One that'll even be used in its sequel in some form or another. There will always be a large following for the Wind Waker's Great Sea, but since its sequel that utilized the Great Sea once more was on the DS and Breath of the Wild being a mainstream title, down the line how the series first embarked into the open-air genre most likely will be looked at as more innovative in the gaming industry. Well, I hope you enjoyed that comparison. That turned out to be longer than I thought. Let me know which overworld you think was more groundbreaking for its time. Hope you all are staying safe during the quarantine, and as always, don't forget to stay hyped. Peace! For for the early what the, something I'll probably say a lot in this video. Gotta burp right about now. Woo! That's how we do it. Shut your crazy ass up. Oh, too fun. All right.